Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be wrapping up the books that I read in the second half of March.
Okay, so I have decided to include the stats and goal checkups as part of my wrap-up. The rest of the video is going to be filmed in my normal location, but here I am near my computer with all of the stats. So in March, I had a really good reading month. I, of course, had spring break, and so I was able to read a lot more than I normally do. I read 25 books, 10,572 pages. That's a lot. I don't think I have had many months during the school year where I've read that many books. Of those books, it should come as no surprise, my top genre is fantasy. And then according to Storygraph, the next two are young adult and middle grade, but I do not count those as genres. And so the next top two, well, top three because they're tied, are politics, history, and essays. And those are all tied at 2. Most of the books I read were fantasy. That's about 17 of the books that I read this month. Of the books that I read, I believe 4 of them as audio and 21 as physical copies. I had some long audiobooks that I was reading. My star ratings, they're pretty high. They're a lot higher than they used to be, and I think Cowpile is helping with that. I had 6 5-star reads. That's a lot. I had 7 4.5-star reads, only 2 4-star reads, and then 6 3.5-star reads, 1 3-star read, and 1 2.5-star read. So my average for the month is 4.17. My averages before this have been in like the 3.5, 3.8 range. Definitely had a good reading month. As far as my goals go, I did finish 2 series. Technically 3 if I count The Deathly Hallows, but I've read that so many times I don't count that as finishing a series. But the 2 that I finished were both part of duologies, and that was Redemptor and Crooked Kingdom. As far as nonfiction goes, I read 5 nonfiction, which definitely meets that goal, and 2 of them came off of my TBR cart, my owned TBR cart. Then for the new Brandon Sanderson goal, I did read The Final Empire. So just starting that. So I am well on my way to meeting all of my goals, and I'm going to throw you back to Past Any for the wrap up of the rest of the books that I read in March.
To start that off, the second half of March really kind of started with spring break. And the first book that I read on spring break and in the second half of March is The Last Quintana. And this book is really popular right now, as it should be. It just won the Newbery Award, as it should. This book does not fit neatly into a genre. And I say that because a lot of people, you could easily slot this into a sci-fi genre because it is very sci-fi. It is about a group of people that have to escape from Earth because Halley's Comet is now going to run into Earth because it got knocked off of its path. There's all sorts of things that ensue with, settling a new planet, spending hundreds of years in stasis, unexpected things happening. So it fits sci-fi for that, 100%. But this so centers native Latinx stories and storytelling that it bends that genre in a way that makes this book beautiful. I've never described a sci-fi book as beautiful before. Petra, the main character, she is the last Quintana. Because of something another character does, she is the last person who remembers all the stories from Earth. This collective set out, and this is all in the synopsis, this collective set out to wipe those out so that there could be a fresh start, so that we wouldn't remember anything of the terrible things that humans had done before. But obviously, you wipe out a person's story, you are basically wiping them out. It's basically cultural genocide, and that's what the collective has done. But Petra, as a 12-year-old, is, and this is middle grades, she is so determined to hold on to these stories, to hold on to memories of her grandmother who they had to leave behind, and memories of her life before that. And her grandmother encouraged her to become this storyteller, and she is determined to preserve these stories and to make a better life for these other kids that are Zetas, help them remember these things. When I got to the end of this book, it was such a gut punch. I'm not going to say anything about the details, not going to say anything, but this book captivated me in a way that a middle grades sci-fi book has not done ever. I loved this book. The next book that I read in the second half of March is Crooked Kingdom. Now, this is not the copy that I read. This is the copy that I purchased on my Atlanta book haul. But I read Crooked Kingdom in 24 hours. I participated in the reading sprints for the Final Book support group to finish it. And it had been a few years since I had read the first book in the duology, Six of Crows, so I did read a recap about it. In this book, it picks up pretty much right after the end of the events in Six of Crows. I will not be talking a lot about plot points in here because that would give away things from the first book. I will say that while I enjoyed it, the big thing about Six of Crows is it's almost like it's a caper. They're running cons. That is what Kaz Brecker, the main character in here, that's what he does. He's a con man. He runs this group. He's had a hard Scrabble life, and there's various things that they are doing, but there's so many different threads in here. I mean, it's a big book, but there's so many different threads in here that I think the overall goal for these different cons gets lost throughout here because different things start cropping up, different things go wrong, a lot of things go wrong, and it changes what they have to do. They have to compensate for something that went wrong to get them back on track, to get towards their final goal. Even at the end, I'm like, wait, what was their final goal? And then the ending, I'm like, did they actually achieve their final goal? It sets it up for a possibility of a sequel series or duology, as she's seemed to be inclined, Leigh Bardugo, to do with the Grishaverse now after the initial first trilogy, which I have not read. As much as I love the cons, there was a show on USA that I absolutely loved. It was all about the cons and then the getting to the end of the episode and then explaining what happened. It got to be too much. It strained the suspension of disbelief just a little bit too much. Not so much that I didn't like the book, but enough that I didn't like it as much as Six of Crows. I did rate this, I compiled it and rated it 4 stars. Ultimately, it was a slightly unsatisfying end to the duology. Next, we have The Stormrunner by J.C. Cervantes. This is the first book in another Rick Riordan imprint book, and this centers Mayan mythology. The main character is, he was born with one leg being shorter than the other, and that gets explained as the gods and humans are not supposed to mix. And so whenever that happens, something goes wrong. And in this case, it is his shorter leg, and he's dealing with that, and he doesn't obviously know that at first. He lives in New Mexico with a volcano in his backyard. He goes exploring, and he's been homeschooled for a year because he just could not take school. But then circumstances all align or malign, whatever the case might be, and he ends up releasing the god of death, Apuch. And so basically he is trying to both figure out what he is now that he knows that he's godborn, he's a demigod, make up for what he did on accident yet was supposed to do and all that confusing stuff, and he's trying to make up for that. Now, I probably will continue to read this series. It definitely fits the Rick Riordan imprint. It doesn't actually go all that deep, at least what I've seen so far, but I realize in a similarity to how I felt with the first book in the Magnus Chase books, I do not have a lot of familiarity with these different types of gods, with this different type of mythology. Because it doesn't follow the paths that we know and are more familiar with, it feels disconcerting and it doesn't almost make sense I realized, okay, that's something that is lowering my expectations on this. But since I realized that I went on to really enjoy the rest of the Magnus Chase books, perhaps that's going to be the same for this book. It read really quickly. I read this again in a 24-hour-ish time period, started it on a Saturday, finished it on a Sunday. This is a decent entry, not one of my favorites in the Rick Riordan imprints, but a series that I will continue and I will finish. The next book that I finished in the month of March, or the second half of the month of March, is The Cat I Never Named. And this I listened to as an audiobook, and I chose it. I had two options. I had Braiding Sweetgrass and I had this one, and I let my dad choose which one we were going to listen to on our drive down. And so I listened to most of it on the drive down to Atlanta while we were in Atlanta, going from bookstore to bookstore, and then on the way back, and then finished it up the next night. This book I first put on my TBR after talking to another one of the English teachers at my school. She teaches 8th grade, and they were going through, I don't know what the theme of the reading choices for the students was. One of them was this book. She raved about it and was really nervous about it. She's an animal lover, and with it being the cat I never named and the scenario that's going on, she was really nervous for the cat. And I admit, different times that creeped in for me as well. But this story is a young adult novelized memoir. So I did listen to the author's note as well, and she talks about the fact that she did change a few things so that it would flow as a story, and obviously she just didn't keep exact diary entries of all of this, and the diary that she did have was lost. So she did her best in reconstructing this. But the main character, Amra, she, and the one who narrates this, she was born in Bosnia. Well, when she was born, it was Yugoslavia. In the early 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia also experienced a very traumatic, violent breakup and became multiple different countries. One of the things that happened was in 1992, Bosnia and Herzegovina had a referendum, and their people voted to separate from Serbia. In Bosnia, for short, you had three main groups. You had the Serbs, you had the Croats, and you had Muslims. And she talks a lot about this and the fact that they weren't necessarily religious Muslims. It was more of an ethnicity or an identity, a cultural identity passed down to them. For her family, she talks about the fact that they never were particularly religious. They never practiced that. She at one point talks about the one prayer, the one Muslim prayer that she knew. But the thing was, if you were Muslim, you were looked down on. The Serbs hated the Muslims. When Bosnia declared its independence or seceded from Serbia, there was a conflict that erupted. And it was a war that lasted for 4 years. Now, when this started in 1992, I was only 7 years old, and it's not something that really sunk in for me. I knew it was happening. I knew of it. I saw some news things, especially as it went on and as the UN and NATO and the US got involved. It was 95, if I'm remembering from the book, when the Bosnians were actually pushing back the Serbs. And they talk about how, Amra talks about how the NATO forces actually started coming in and finally firing against the Serbs. That would make sense for why I remember this more, because I was about 10 years old then and not 7. And so that I remember a news story from then. But I never studied this in school. I never knew a lot about it. But the trauma and the events that happened during this war, it makes you think like it's something from World War II or something from these horrific wars in the past. And while this is in the past, you wouldn't expect it to be something that happened in the 90s. And she talks about their life in their town of Bihać for these 4 years where they were completely cut off from everything. And their city was besieged, and they faced so much trauma and hardship. It was so eye-opening and so well written. This is definitely a book that more people, way more people, need to read and need to learn about and understand. Obviously, when Amra wrote this, what's happening in Ukraine was not happening then. This was published in 2020. but the parallels between what the West is doing in Ukraine is so striking of what they did or slash didn't do in Bosnia. And I will say there is a step up on what they're actually doing, and perhaps they're learning their lesson from what happened in Bosnia during this war. The correlations are striking. And as someone who studies comparative history, this is what you need to do. You need to compare those. You need to learn those lessons and take them forward. So I highly recommend this and will definitely be purchasing a physical copy to add to my collection. Next, I read book 2 in the Trials of Apollo series. It has been a while since I read book 1. I think the reason that I didn't continue on initially with the Trials of Apollo series is because Apollo is such a conceited character. He's supposed to be. Apollo as a god is extremely conceited, and he was so annoying in the first one, and that, you know, gets to part of the reason why Zeus made him mortal, to teach him a lesson, and he's trying to survive and go through this. But you can actually see more character growth in this book, way more. I will say that a lot of the details from the first one, setting everything up, I don't remember because it's been so long, and they were alluded to and brought up in this book. I, again, read this one quickly, not as quickly as I thought I would have. Again, it's still not one of my favorites because Apollo is less of an annoying character. His conceited actions that sometimes crop up in this book were a lot easier to handle. Plus, it featured Leo quite frequently in this, and Leo's one of my favorite characters from the Heroes of Olympus series. I will be continuing on with the rest of the series in quick succession, hopefully finishing up this series during the week of spring break. So the next audiobook that I finished is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Going into it, I didn't know what to expect. And then when I first started reading it, I didn't know whether I was going to continue because Kimmerer drops right into the story by narrating a tale, a Native American story, Potawatomi story, and I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. I expected something based on botany and weaving together the story, or at the very least, I guess, a more traditional way of framing the story so that I knew where we were going. As the book progressed, we got more of that. We got more of a structure that I could wrap my head around. Kimmerer does not follow a traditional structure when it comes to books such as a science book or a history of science book or a book of collection of mythology. I think part of that comes from the fact that, yes, there are different ways of telling stories in different cultures. And the one that I am most familiar with is the very Western one. It's one that I prefer. I do prefer a more chronological story. I do prefer more organization. I do prefer a more detailed structure. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy this book. Throughout the whole thing, Kimmerer takes little snippets and then shifts how they are placed next to each other and then asks you to reframe. That shifting reframes the story, and she makes brilliant points with these, and I learned so much from that way of storytelling. If you were to go into this book, keep that in mind. It's not a traditional structure, as it shouldn't be for what it is telling. I haven't compiled it yet, but I think it would be probably a 3.5, maybe 4-star read. Not one that I'm going to add to my personal collection, but definitely one that I learned from. The next 3 books that I read completed the Trials of Apollo series. In my wrap-up of the second book in this series, I stated that I was reserving judgment for a later time because I had seen with the Magnus Chase books that Riordan had taken a start that felt a little off to me and then really expanded it and created a world and a narrative that I wholeheartedly enjoy and now have right here. He did the same thing with this, but it went so much deeper. These books are so deep for middle grades books. And it started with the third book, The Burning Maze. In each of these books, Apollo and Meg, the demigod who he is like bonded to during this time of punishment, they are traveling across the country and they are interacting with other characters from the previous two series. And I really appreciated that, seeing the different characters, getting reacquainted with them, but not having to go into their perspective. This is solely narrated by Apollo, which I appreciated. Riordan did the multi-perspective fine, great in Heroes of Olympus, but I appreciated going back to the single perspective in here. In the Trials of Apollo, the two demigods that he meets back up with in this book are Piper and Jason. What happened about 3/4 of the way through the book made me actually look up, spoilers, like, this can't be happening. He couldn't have done this, but Riordan did, and it served such a powerful, as such a powerful jumpstart or continuation to Apollo's character growth. I mean, how many times can you talk about a Greek god's character growth? They're usually terrible beings. And Apollo is at the beginning of this series, which made me not want to continue on with it. But by the time we get to the end, oh, just wait. That scene, Riordan had laid some groundwork leading up to that. The fact that he went there and he stuck with it, I knew from that point on, I wholeheartedly loved the series, had to see where it went, and need to add it to my collection. So the events of the Burning Maze, they're in Southern California. From there, they return to Camp Jupiter. There's a task that they have to complete regarding that thing that I'm not going to spoil in the third book. And so Apollo and Meg are now going to Camp Jupiter, which is up in the San Francisco area. So that's what happens in the Tyrant's Tomb. And if I thought that he had ramped up, he'd taken the emotional gut check, I don't even know, he'd taken the emotional tension up to a 10 in the Burning Maze, no, he goes even higher. He keeps it going in the Tyrant's Tomb. And the demigods that play a more prominent role in this book are Frank, Hazel, and Raina. And I really appreciate Raina's character arc as well, because she didn't serve a very prominent role. She wasn't one of the ones that went on all of these journeys in the Heroes of Olympus, but as the series went on, she became even more important. And I really love the growth that she was able to go on throughout this book. Her arc, brilliant. Of course, Apollo is still making huge strides in his growth as well. And in the interaction with Frank and Hazel dealing with what has just happened in the Burning Maze, there's a lot of stuff in here where Apollo has to confront all the horrible things that he has done as a god, the various things that get brought up in this book from mythology. He's starting to realize, wow, that was awful. That was terrible. Why was I like that? Why am I like that? Am I like that? There is something that happens with one of the characters in this book that apparently a lot of people felt like was a cheap trick. And when it first happened, I went, no, Riordan, you did not just do that. Not again. So I was very relieved when the so-called cheap trick occurred in the narrative. It didn't erase what had happened. It made total sense, and it made you love this character even more. And I can't really say anything more about that without giving away spoilers, which I won't do. This book got so emotional for me, and I remember reading it going, wait a second, this is a Rick Riordan book. How is this supposed to be so emotional and moving? I don't get this, but I loved it. Then to cap it off, we have the Tower of Nero. So we return once again to New York City, which is where the series started. Meg was, it's complicated, but Meg was a quote-unquote stepdaughter of Nero. Riordan really gets into the complicated psychological torture and stress and all of the effects of what someone like Nero, the master manipulator, horrible person, has done to Meg and to the other demigods that he has adopted and made part of his entourage, I guess you would say. In the first book, Meg did not do so well when she had to stand up to Nero, who she considered as her father, but also the beast. This book was an opportunity for her to show growth from there, which I found phenomenal. In this book, the primary demigods that you are working with, at least that are returnees, major players from the previous series, I guess not, Solus is not a major player, but as far as Apollo is concerned, he is. But the major player returning in this is Nico. And Nico, wow, what a tortured character. And he has had such an arc throughout these books, because coming from the original Percy Jackson series where he loses his sister and then he has to deal with that. And then in the Heroes of Olympus where he rescues Hazel and then spends time tortured, and then he shadow travels the statue of Aphrodite back, or Athena, sorry, the statue of Athena. Just so much. Nico deserves, I saw seeds for something focused on Nico. And I don't know if it's a whole series. I don't think it should be a whole series, but even if it's like a standalone, just for Nico. Nico deserves that. His arc, I don't think is complete. His character still has more room to grow, but grew a lot in here. Obviously, this is the final part of the Trials of Apollo, and Rick Riordan is not going to kill off gods, not like lore. It felt like a fitting conclusion. It was not as emotional as the Tyrant's Tomb, but this arc, the whole series arc, wrapped up so well in this book. Chef's kiss. So good. I can't really say all that much about the plot because, you know, final book in a 5-book series. I'm so glad that this discovery of the Uncle Rick read-along on BookTube spurred me to get back into Riordan's backlist that I hadn't read, the Magnus Chase books and the Trials of Apollo, because these are amazing. Next, I read The Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1914 by Michael J. Gonzalez. I had had a little bit of trepidation before opening this book because I guess I didn't feel enthusiastic about reading it. There's nothing intimidating about this book at all. It reads very quickly, like a undergraduate level textbook, so not too complicated, not too in-depth, although it has the details there, and it lays everything out in an easy to understand, easy to use as a textbook to teach sort of manner. Thus, it's not flowy, pretty prose. It's pretty straightforward, not too dry, not too flowery. Like I just said, and I'm repeating myself, it did make me realize that there's a lot about the Mexican Revolution that I did not know. I probably will keep it on my shelf because it's definitely something that I want to expand my knowledge on and my own personal collection of history books. Next, we have The Invisible Library by Genevieve Cogman. I did not realize when I first put this on my TBR, I did not realize it was a series. It's an 8-book series, I believe, and I may continue reading. So there's a whole genre of books called cozy mysteries. I don't have a lot of familiarity except for knowing what that genre is. This to me feels like a cozy paranormal investigator type mystery. The main character, she works in a library that's in a different dimension. And as part of her job, she goes into all of these different alternate universes to retrieve different works of literature so the library can have and protect these different types of literature. But she gets sent on this mission shortly after retrieving something else. She wasn't expecting to go back out that scene, and she now has a mentee, someone she's training. And also she gets thrown in there, and the big bad guy, her arch nemesis, is suddenly there. And so she has to face all of that throughout the course of this book. There's not a lot of character development. The plot moves at breakneck speed. Some of the magic in there is definitely for adults and not for children. It's a little bit gross at sometimes, but not gratuitously, not over the top. It didn't wow me, but I enjoyed it. So if I have a chance, maybe I will pick up another one in this series. Maybe I won't. I'm not too fussed to continue right away with this series. It's not bad. Next we have the 1619 Project. This is one of those books that I bought when we were at the beach for the week. I had originally intended to read this in hardcover form. I realized that I was a little bit behind on my TBR for March, even though I surpassed the number. And I found the audiobook version of it and decided to listen to it because I have had a lot of success with nonfiction audiobooks. I think for me, my rating and my experience with this book would have been higher if I had read it physically. This book is a collection. It's not one solid narrative throughout. It is a collection of essays put together by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the New York Times journalist who started the project originally. She has a couple different essays in here, and there's several other people who have essays, but also between the essays there are different historical blurbs or poems or other sorts of pieces brought together by a lot of different authors. I think the collection for itself, I think that's a great idea. I struggle to see the connecting thread. A lot of the essays, they're themed essays, so they didn't move chronologically. And several of the essays repeated things mentioned in other essays, which is prone to happen because the essays were written by different people. I don't think this is a bad book, and I'm definitely going to be keeping it. Definitely going to be keeping it on my history shelf. I wanted so much more from this, and I think that's what lowered my enjoyment of the book a little bit, but I will admit that I think this is better experienced as a physical copy, especially since some of the narrators, they were all of the narrators were the authors themselves, I believe, except for maybe some of the poetry and other things in between. It may have been the ones, but the essays I know were narrated by the authors. Just because you're a really good writer is not necessarily automatically going to make you a good audiobook narrator. So I ended up rating this 3.5 stars. It's definitely a needed book and something that people should study and read. I just had a slightly lower experience than I expected. And the last book that I read in the month of March is Keeper of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. I had heard some people talking about this book, I believe on the Final Book support group, because the 9th book has come out, and I don't know if that's actually the last book in the series or not, but people were talking about that. And I had not really heard about this series before, even though it's been around for a while. And I decided I'm going to pick up the first book in this series and see if it's a series for me. Spoiler alert, it is. I love this. I thought it was absolutely adorable. So Sophie Foster is a precocious child who's a high school senior at 12 years old. She feels like she doesn't even really fit into her family, and then she finds out that she doesn't actually fit into her family because she's actually an elf. There are other worlds that exist, and they travel to them, well, other hidden cities I should say. And they travel to them using light, and there's a school that she needs to go to, but she's behind because she's been raised by humans and not elves. And there's possibly a conspiracy about her that gets her into trouble and endangers her and one of her friends. It's very, in structure, in concept, very similar to Harry Potter. And I, of course, you know, I love Harry Potter. But it's not a Harry Potter copycat, but it's got a lot of those tropes, and I love them. And so there's not a lot of depth in here, but it's a middle grade novel, so I'm not expecting there to be a ton of depth in there. I'm reading this as a middle grade novel, and I don't know if it ages up into YA as the series continues, but we shall see, because I'm definitely going to be continuing on with this series. I loved the characters. I love the development. Well, the fact that Sophie's not automatically good at everything. There are lots of things that she's good at, but it's almost like she was created for these different things, and she's like, I don't know what's going on. I really enjoyed it, and I thought that this was an excellent way to finish off the month. So as you will have seen from the stats clip that I put at the beginning of this video, I had a fantastic reading month, and I am so excited about all these amazing books that I got to read, and I am thrilled to be on BookTube and finding so many of these books through BookTube and finding so many amazing books that I wouldn't have found otherwise. So I'm really looking forward to what April's going to bring. And going forward, I'm probably going to be doing my wrap-ups as one video, so they will be a little bit longer, but I'm going to try to be a little more concise in the wrap-ups and my thoughts about the books, especially if I've talked about the book in a different reading vlog. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day.